and welcome to this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm Steve Doyle, and I'm your host. Well, I'm very happy to bring this episode to you. I've been sort of waiting a long time to have this guest on the show today. Our guest today is Michael Kean, who is the recently appointed Wiggins of the Baker Street Irregulars. Michael is a great guy and a terrific Sherlockian, and I've been wanting to have him on the show for a while now. So, without any further ado, welcome to the show, Michael. It's really great to have you here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Steve.
Well, I know this conversation's been a long time coming. I wanted to talk to you about your role. Well, first I want to, it's good to just talk to you apart from the fact that you are now our new Wiggins of the BSI. But once you became Wiggins, I wanted to see if I can get you on the show. And I've had a lot of suggestions that we get you on here. But I know you had a lot on your plate at first, leading the BSI in the middle of a pandemic. So it's good to have you now. So.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see the pandemic subsiding somewhat. Fingers crossed.
Yes, fingers crossed indeed. So we start this way with everybody. Michael, where are you coming to us from today?
We live on the Monterey Peninsula of the central coast of California, specifically in Pebble Beach, which may be better known to the golfers of the world because it is a golf mecca. No, I am not a golfer. We just happen to live in this beautiful part of the world and are very delighted to be here. Although we have lived really across the country. I'm originally from Philadelphia, moved back to the city of brotherly love after I finished my graduate work and lived there for a decade. Then moved west and lived in Chicago for about 3 years before taking a new professional position out here on the left coast 39 years ago. And we've been here that long.
So it's been a slow, incremental westward migration.
Exactly. We can't go any much further west in the U.S. Unless we go to Hawaii, and we have no plans to do that.
There's a Sherlockian society in Hawaii now. So
we're everywhere, thank goodness.
That's true. The other thing that I always like to talk to people about, because I just find it interesting personally, and so I like to ask people how, because people enter this hobby from every walk of life. So how did you find Sherlock Holmes?
Well, this may sound somewhat familiar to your interview a couple of fortnightly dispatches ago with Glenn Maranker. Similar, but not exactly the same way. Unlike many of our Sherlockian friends and BSIs, I was not an avid Sherlockian as a child. In fact, I will admit to having never read any Sherlock Holmes stories as a child, other than the classic comic book versions of A Study in Scarlet and the Hound of the Baskervilles. It wasn't. Yeah, I mean, I was certainly aware of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and other than perhaps having seen a couple of the Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce films on the Late Show on Saturday nights, really had read nothing. Fast forward to Columbus, Ohio, when I was in graduate school and dating Connie, my then girlfriend and now wife of 53 years. She was an undergraduate and we had no money at all. So our entertainment on a Friday night was after I finished my work in the stacks, working on my dissertation. We would walk around a local shopping mall or something and window shop and poke into stores and stuff. And we had walked into a large chain bookstore back in the days when there were such things. Right. And I had been, I guess, complaining about the fact that I never had time to read things I really wanted to read because I was always working on my dissertation. And Connie said, "Well, when you're finished with this, what do you want to read?" And we just happened to pass a large display table that had a stack of the Doubleday complete Sherlock Holmes stories. And I happened to spy that and said, I've never read all the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'd really like to read them. Well, it must have been around my birthday because a couple of weeks later, Connie presented me with a copy of that as a birthday gift.
Mm.
And I put it on my nightstand and each night read one of the stories and I got hooked. And that's pretty much how it started.
I love
Uh,
that story.
yeah, Columbus, Ohio at the time didn't have anything in the way of an organized Sherlock Holmes group. In fact, I was totally unaware that there were such animals. We moved to Philadelphia about 2 years later, and I learned about the Sons of the Copper Beeches and was unable to become affiliated with them right away, but also found out a year or two later that a new group called the Master's Class was being organized and was able to attend, actually not their first meeting, but the second meeting of the Master's Class. Got heavily involved with that group and ultimately about 5 years later when we moved to Chicago was one of the two headmasters of the group. And that was just a wonderful, wonderful group. I mean, it was, as you're well aware, and perhaps many of your viewers are, that was, in a way, an incubator for probably several dozen now BSIs and very active Sherlockians around the country.
Well, I think
So
that's one of the many benefits of our our what I think is a unique thing in the world, the Science Society affiliations across the country affiliated with each other through their BSI affiliation. And if you're active in this hobby and in our community, you start to see that what you described, that common thread of people who were invited in locally and then began to make connections and make friends first locally and then a little further out and further out. And next thing you know, that's the network that we all kind of get caught up in. And I think it's a really valuable thing, in this hobby. And I do think it's rather unique as well.
it's true. Absolutely, Steve. I think the signs are tremendously important. I think without the signs, the the focus of our world, of the world of Sherlock Holmes and the canonical focus, probably, I won't say wouldn't exist, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as robust or wonderful as it is. Because if you think about it, the Baker Street Irregulars, and I'll just limit this comment to this country right now,
Mm-hmm.
the Baker Street Irregulars meets officially once a year in New York for dinner, and nowadays with some a number of ancillary activities as well. And we continue to be a by invitation only organization, at least for the dinner. And as such, there is a limited number of individuals that could avail themselves of the, and I will say, pleasure of being able to participate. I mean, as you're aware, we have approximately 300 members worldwide, the overwhelming majority of whom are in the United States or Canada. And I have no idea, there's never been, as far as I know, a census of Sherlockians in this country or the world. But my guess is there are many thousands, if not tens of thousands, of enthusiastic Sherlockians, probably at least a third of which, and I'm going out on a limb here, are in some way or another either affiliated with a scion or would like to be. So
Right.
the scions are tremendously important, I think.
I agree. I think So for all you viewers out there who, if you don't have one nearby, start one.
Yeah.
Good. You'll find like-minded friends. It's a thing, and it's really important, and it's a real enhancement, I think, to the greater enjoyment of. I mean, it's fun to share things that you're enthusiastic with people. I mean, that's really what it's about, and I think that's so. Yes, um, I'm glad to hear you say that because I think the scions are really important to the whole hobby, not just to the BSI. So, well, Michael, let's talk about. So, well, I want to ask, fall back for a moment. Do you still have that copy of the complete Sherlock Holmes?
I do indeed. In fact, and I know later in this in this interview, you usually ask about collecting, and I'll be happy to bore you and a little bit on that. But since you asked the question now, at least about that, I mean, I have a fairly large number-wise collection, um, uh, probably close to, or maybe slightly more than 7,000 volumes and items. And when people come into my library who are non-Sherlockians, usually the first question that they ask after, "Wow, look at all these books. What's your most valuable one?"
Oh yeah,
And
followed no doubt by. Have you read all these? That's the
yeah, well, that's right. And to take a step back, have you read all these? I'm always able to deadpan and say, well, as a matter of fact, yes. And I sort of point to the section of my library that are various copies of the canon, of which I probably have, I don't know, in terms of pirate editions and all kinds of other editions, I don't know, 400 or 500. And I can say, yes, of course I have. And then I point out the fact that these are all different copies of the same stories in the same book. So if I've read through the canon once, I've read all these 400 or 500 books.
It's very efficient.
They don't quite understand that, but at any rate, but they usually see these, and many of them are old and at least from appearance rare, and they always ask, not non-bibliophiles always ask, wow, what's the most valuable one? And I say, well, there's monetary value and there's personal value. And the two most personally valuable books that I have are, and I pulled down that Doubleday complete Sherlock Holmes that Connie gave me in 1968, and that's inscribed to me from her. And it was, again, before we were even married. And then I also have a somewhat, it's not tattered, but an older, not great condition copy of the Memorial Edition, published in, what was that, 30 or 31. That was my father's, that I discovered quite by accident when my mother was moving from her home, the home I grew up in Philadelphia, to an apartment when she was already in her late 70s or 80s. And my dad was an avid reader, and there were bookcases and bookcases of his old books that were up in the attic. And I was going through them, and lo and behold, I found this 2-volume memorial edition with his signature in it. And it was obviously old enough that he had read it. It was, I won't say well thumbed, but it was clear that he had read it. My dad died when I was 23. And I really never knew him as an adult. That is to say, I left for college when I was 17 and really didn't leave home again. I mean, we saw each other when I would visit and things like that, but we never really had a real adult relationship. And I had no idea that my dad ever read Sherlock Holmes. And what I wouldn't give to have known that, or today to be able to have a conversation with him and to talk about my love for the canon and how I've gotten involved. So those are the two, for me, most valuable items, both of which in terms of monetary value are probably worth $20, if that. So
Right. Oh, I love that story. I can relate to it. My own personal most valuable to me are intrinsically worthless
yeah.
copies of adventures and memoirs I got for Christmas when I was 14
Yeah.
from my parents, who are both gone now. And if there's a fire, I'm grabbing that first. You know, that's
Yeah. I agree.
yeah. Wow, I love that story. Thank you for sharing that. That's
Oh,
great.
you're welcome.
So you had a one of your roles before you were Wiggins was running BSI, the BSI Press, BSI Book Publishing, and and I know you had a career in publishing. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it may have informed um, the because you were there kind of on the ground floor when the Irregulars began to really kind of amp up book publishing.
Sure, Steve. Yes, I did have, for 25 years, I worked in a variety of different roles for a large international publishing company, McGraw-Hill. Um, and uh, Mike was aware of this, and at some point came to me, and it was when it was certainly well after Mike had begun moving ahead more robustly with the Baker Street Irregulars Press, and it again it became more complex. And he came to me and said, in fact, it was at one of the Minnesota conferences, triennial meetings, and he invited me to have breakfast with him. And at that point, he talked about the publishing program, and he said, you know, there are really a number of areas we really need to ramp up on, and I need help doing it. And you have the kind of background and the interest. Would you be willing to do that? And we talked a little bit more about it. And I said, you know, I would really be very interested, but I said, with my work commitments right now, I don't think I can do it well. However, I am planning to retire in about a year or perhaps 15 months time. And if in fact you can either wait until then or appoint somebody else, I'd be happy to get involved as soon as I retire. And he said, okay, I appreciate that. And I understand that, because Mike, as you know, was a corporate executive for his career as well. That's where I assumed it would end, at least. And of course, Mike had a great memory, and I won't exaggerate and say the day after I retired, I got a call from him. But shortly thereafter, at any rate, Mike called me and reminded me of the conversation.
You're like, oh yeah,
and,
I did
and
say.
I was pleased to receive the call. So we spent quite a bit of time together talking about the various foci that Mike had in mind. I mean, we really didn't have and organize what in the publishing business we refer to as a publishing plan, in terms of and usually or at least when I was involved in the kind of publishing we would do, we would have a 5-year publishing plan in terms of the kind of publications we wanted to do over the course of 5 years, 3 years, etc., and moving ahead. And then there were all kinds of, in the corporate world, of course, it was much more complex in terms of investment and return on investment and everything else. But there was also, when Mike and I spoke, conversations about promotion, advertising, um, 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 making the Baker Street Irregulars Press more professional, basically. I accepted the role. I should point out the fact that John Berquist was heavily involved already, but his involvement, and John had a background in what in publishing we talk about as style editing or
Right.
production, and which I did not. I mean, I was aware of it and knew how it worked, but it wasn't my area of interest or focus. And John was at the time and continues to be the main focus of that. I jumped aboard, and I can tell you that it was challenging, but nowhere near as challenging as it would have been had it not been for the fact that one, Mike was extremely, extremely supportive of it and took a very hands-on uh, interest in it. Steve, you're well aware, given your role in the Baker Street Journal, what a hands-on interest Mike Whalen has always
Oh yeah, sure.
taken in all of these initiatives. So it was real helpful. And
Yeah, I mean it's true. You know, if the person that you're working with and for is kind of is detached or unsupportive, maybe not negatively supportive, but sort of removed, it can make a huge difference as vis-a-vis someone who's invested in it and supportive and um, appreciative. That all makes a huge difference in what in your
absolutely so.
ability to do a good job.
Yeah. So anyway, we that's how it moved along, and one thing led to another, and the role actually expanded and continued to expand as the program expanded.
Mhm.
And you've probably heard me say, and others as well, that the Baker Street Irregulars is first and foremost a literary society, and what better focus for a literary society than to publish books or journals? And I think that, in a way, after keeping green the memory of the master, is probably one of the most important things that the BSI does and will continue to do.
I think it's wonderful. I mean, of course, you know I like books and publishing books, and publishing has changed. So I mean, the challenges it's gone through in the last. Well, we won't even talk about the pandemic. That's a, you know, we're not even sure where that's going to end up really, but but just in the last decade or so, the technology and the uh, sort of the rise of that democratization of people to people's ability to get things in print, and which is wonderful, but it's also you know there's a downside to that too, and so I think it puts pressure on publishers to pay attention to quality, um, and um, and I think that I love the fact that the BSI book publishing has seen a steady ramping up in quality since it really kind of went into gear. I think that's a I don't know. I think it's wonderful, and I you know and so you know hats off to everybody in the who's making that happen. I think that's really it's really great, and you know it's all good too. I mean we've seen a few other publishers come online here over the last few years, and we all raise each other's bar. I think you know, and I think that's there's no downside to that. So
Yeah. Well,
um,
you make a very important point there in terms of quality, Steve, and how technology has changed the face of publishing. I mean, literally, with today, with technology, almost anyone can be a publisher, and there are some very good things coming, but there is, dare I say, a lot of schlock. uh,
right,
as well. And one of the things that the Baker Street Irregulars has continued to focus on is to maintain a high level of quality. You know, our current co-publishers, Bob Katz and John Berquist, are absolute sticklers about that. And we're not so anxious to suddenly increase the number of publications we produce on an annual basis. No, we pretty much do 2, 3 on an unusual year, 4 books a year, but more typically 2 or 3, and that's fine because those books are always of the highest quality.
right. That's how we are over at Wessex Press too. I mean,
Sure.
you gotta sort of um, you can do more. You know what's that phrase? You can have I don't know. You can have them fast, good, and cheap, but you only get two
Yeah,
of the three.
yeah.
You know, you can throw in there quantity too. You can increase the number, but you know, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. You start to get beyond a certain number, and your ability to do a good job on any of them goes down precipitously, I think. So I think it's,
Absolutely.
and small, there's a, small press, small niche publishing at the level that for instance, the BSI publish at. BSI is able to do things that larger publishers couldn't touch just because of the
Oh,
economic factors of it. It's not worth
exactly.
their time to do something this specialized. And so there's an important role for these small Sherlockian publishers.
Absolutely. And also the fact that we're all doing this as a labor of love. I mean, it's not like
Right.
we get paid to do this.
Right.
And our folks are all volunteers, many of whom are spending countless hours of their own time to do this. In the world of commercial publishing, that, I mean, they would love to have really fine staff members work for nothing, but that just doesn't happen. So that's why, that's one of the reasons we're able to maintain the high level of quality that we do. And we'll, as far as the BSI press, and I know the same thing with the Gasogene press, it'll continue to be that way.
Oh, it will be. Yeah, and should be, I think. I think that's that's one of its quirky traits and some strengths of it is that you have people who are devoted to it and who work hard at it as opposed to just being paid to do something. I think there's a big difference in the outcome of that. Michael, let's take a break. We need to hear from our commercial sponsor. Okay, we're back. Well, now we're talking about books. Let's talk about collecting. You just mentioned an astounding number of books in your library. I think that's wonderful. So, do you, collecting is tricky. Do you pursue collecting, or do you specialize? What's your, do you have a particular area of interest that you're
Well, that's a perfect lead-in question. If I didn't know better, I would have thought perhaps I'd have provided you with these, but I didn't. Um, when I first, well, first off, I should say that again, not being very knowledgeable about Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle, when I first got involved in this, when I was in my early 20s, I was suddenly amazed to find out that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote other things than Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I remember going through a used bookstore one time and finding a couple of Doyle novels, non-Sherlockian novels, and saying, where does Sherlock Holmes fit into this? Well, obviously, he didn't fit into the White Company or the refugees or
right?
etc. And I started learning about Doyle and got really, really interested in Arthur Conan Doyle as well. So at the same time that I was trying to acquire Sherlock Holmes books, I was also interested in reading and acquiring non-Sherlockian Doyle books. And starting literally from zero. I mean, when we moved from Columbus, Ohio to Philadelphia in 1970, I had the Doubleday Complete Edition. I had received as a 25th birthday gift when my mom asked me what I'd like. I had seen the Baring Gould annotated Sherlock Holmes at a bookstore, and it was selling for the grandiose price of $25 for the 2-volume slipcase edition.
That was real
Much
money
more
back
than
then.
that was significant money, especially for a starving graduate student. And I told my mom, I said, that's what I really, really like. So she bought me that as a 25th birthday gift. And so I had that. I had the Doubleday Complete, and I'd found a used copy of the Baring Gould Sherlock Holmes biography. And those were the 3 books I had. And then, and Philly at the time had a good number of used bookstores all over the place. So I started visiting them. I always had lots of books. Two of my three college degrees are in English literature, so I read a bit of literature, but then started discovering all of these things. And if you're starting from owning a half a dozen Sherlockian or Doylean books, every time you add to the collection, you're significantly increasing the percentage of the size of your library. So I mean, if I would come home from a bookstore with three new volumes, or they were used, but three additional volumes, wow, and suddenly
I'm going to a second shelf.
Yeah, anything that I saw that was Sherlockian or Doylean, I would buy with the assumption that it was like, no more than $5 or $6 or $10 or something like that. So I got sort of off doing that. And then two things occurred. On one, for a long time, I didn't consider myself a collector. And I think it finally came to me at some point, I don't remember how long ago it was, when I paid the grandiose sum of like $50 for a book. I finally had to admit to myself, I'm not just an accumulator, I must be a collector. That was one. But at that point...
Was that a tough admission to make?
Yeah. At that point, I was further down the line where I already probably had, I don't know, a couple of hundred books, that I was past the point that I felt comfortable specializing. I will say that in retrospect, if I could do it again, knowing what I know now, I would specialize. I mean, a Don Pollock who specializes in the Hound of the Baskervilles or something like that, I would do that today if I was starting again. Having said that, however, I specialize in being a generalist. I have what I would consider to be a very decent, large general collection. And these days it is purposely general in that it's divided into probably a dozen different sections, if you will. I think I have all of the Shaw 100 and have had for a while. And I'm fortunate enough because I'm old enough and have been collecting long enough that I have first editions of all of the canon. No, not a Beatles, but all the other firsts in British, American, Canadian, etc. I have a large section on non-Sherlockian Doyle. I really like the other Doyle writings, as I know a lot of Sherlockians do as well, and probably have, I don't know, at least 1,000 different copies of the non-Sherlockian Doyle, including virtually all of the firsts. I'm probably missing a few of them. And then I have a fairly decent section of Sherlock Holmes and film and television and theater. I know that's a particular love of yours, and I have
it is one of my sort of sub areas that I specialize in.
And then there's of course the schlock. I mean,
which
I don't avidly collect anymore, but when it comes my way, friends of mine, know that I'm a Sherlockian and a collector, so they may find, I don't know, something, a hot water bottle with Sherlock Holmes on it, and they buy it and give it to me. Those are not.
I love that stuff. But if you go around back there around the corner, you can't really see it from where I'm sitting, but believe me, there's a lot of weird stuff back there.
Yeah, it's there. So I mean, I don't avidly seek it, but if it comes my way,
it tends to find you after a while,
Yeah, exactly. So that's pretty much it. And I will admit that I spend probably more of my waking hours in my library than any other place, because not only, and it's not because I'm working on the collection. No, I'm not. But my desk and my computer tend to be down here, and this is what better place to conduct all of the BSI business, which I do. And I'm also fortunate enough that the room in which it is has a fireplace. So I've got a couple of very comfortable leather chairs, and a fireplace, and
Sounds
can
perfect.
sit down here and have a wonderful environment. Our dog will jump in, come in, curl up by the fire, or sometimes try to get in my lap. She's a little too big for that, but so I spend a lot of time here. It's a very soothing place.
I get it. I want to ask you about, collecting. Some people recently have started to sort of say, I don't collect books. I kind of collect experiences.
Ah,
And I find that very interesting because, I do think about, sometimes I marvel, that's really more accurate, at some of the experiences that this hobby has afforded me personally. Meeting people or finding yourself in a place that I never would have been here if it wasn't for this. And have you had that thought? Is that do you have a collection of experiences that this hobby has afforded you that really stand out to you?
oh, absolutely, Steve. Absolutely. What a great question. And I mean, I would uh, respond initially by saying, and I hope this doesn't sound heretical, but as important and wonderful as the canon is, um, what what I view our hobby, our passion, is, yes, the Sherlockian canon is the foundation, the basis of it, but ultimately it's about the people. It's about the people. It's about the friendships, and the fun that we have, and the experiences all ultimately relate to the people. We're fortunate enough, as I said, living in a nice part of the world, and very often people will come out to the West Coast, and they may be visiting San Francisco and then want to come south to Pebble Beach and Carmel by the Sea and down to Big Sur. And if they're Sherlockians and if they know where I live, they very frequently will contact me and want to get together. And it's a wonderful, for me, a great pleasure to have fellow Sherlockians visit and spend some time. And I love to show them the area, but we also usually end up in the library with a good glass of wine or two or three. And so just being with the people is wonderful. It's really, I mean, other experiences, and this in a way cycles back to your question about science societies. The experiences that you have with people in science. Steve, I know you've been involved in your local group for many, many years, and play the major leadership role with that group. And I've had the pleasure to attend a couple of meetings over the years, and what wonderful people they are. And it's just such a pleasure to meet these new people. When I first moved here 39 years ago to take a new job, and was in my new office, I don't know, probably a month or so, not even that. And the local division of McGraw-Hill, where I was their vice president for publishing and research, published, as a lot of these places at the time, this is again before desktop computers and everything else, would publish a little monthly in-house newsletter. Most of it was full of, Joe Smith just, bowled 250 at the local bowling alleys, or so-and-so's daughter just had a baby, or something like that. There were other things too. And information about personnel changes. So there was a big article in that monthly one about Michael Kean. Welcome to Michael Kean, the new publisher, et cetera, et cetera. And at sort of the end of it, it talked about my family and talked about my interests, and it mentioned Sherlock Holmes as an interest. A day or two later, one of the other people that worked for the company, and we had about 300 people that locally. We were actually the largest private employer on the Monterey Peninsula at the time. So anyway, this fellow shows up in my office. He introduced himself, and we had a nice conversation. And he said, "By the way," he said, "I noticed you're interested in Sherlock Holmes. You should meet my father." I said, "Oh, who's your father?" And he mentioned a name which didn't mean anything to me. And he said, "Well, he's the head of the local Sherlock Holmes Society." I said, "What? There isn't, I had no idea there was a local Sherlock Holmes Society here." He said, "Yeah, it's called the Diogenes Club." Well, this was one of the um, stealth societies. The Diogenes Club at the time had been in existence for almost 20 years,
Yeah,
but
that's a good
they
run.
were
Yeah.
unaware that there were other Sherlock Holmes societies elsewhere. And as a
Wow.
result, I don't think any of them even knew of the existence of the Baker Street Journal.
Isn't that
And
something?
so no one knew of their existence, and they didn't know of anyone else's
I mean,
existence.
it's weird because occasionally you'll meet a person who loves Sherlock Holmes and reads the stories and but knows nothing about
Yeah,
the
exactly.
world, the Sherlockian world. But to find a whole society who's
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of
Well,
on
exactly.
their own Galapagos island.
Well, a good example, good example. So at any rate, I got invited to a meeting, and one thing led to another, and I became active in the group and tried to somewhat expand their knowledge base to the world outside of this small enclave in Central California,
Wow,
which has happened over the years. This is a long précis to interesting experiences. And just to give you an example, I think it's sort of somewhat humorous at any rate. The Diogenes Club at the time, actually, they continue to meet 6 times a year. It's an all male, and something I've been pushing to change unsuccessfully thus far for over a decade. Group that meets for dinner, black tie, 6 times a year,
wow,
and pretty much follows the usual Scion agenda. I mean, we'll have cocktails, in this case, dinner, and there'll be a quiz, there'll be a presentation, there'll be toasts,
mhm.
that kind of thing. In those days, and this was back in the late 80s, early 90s, I guess, we were meeting at a small restaurant that had a private room in Carmel. And then after our meeting, often a smaller group, and this group, by the way, wasn't that big, although for a small area, we had about usually 20 people at
Well, that's
our
pretty
dinner
good.
meetings.
Yeah.
And we would wander off to one of the local watering holes in Carmel before they closed down for a nightcap. Um, so in this case, that's what we had done. And there were probably a half dozen of us, gentlemen, I use the term loosely. And we were meeting at a place called the Forge in the Forest, which was a nice restaurant that had a big outdoor area with fire pits and things like that. And we were sitting around, and at a large table, caddy corner to us, was a group of about 8 or 10 young women, all very nicely dressed, who were in town for one of their girlfriends or sorority sisters was getting married, and this was the I forget what you call it when they go out for it's not a bachelor party, but whatever.
Bachelorette,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Anyway, that was their. They were all in town for that, and there, as I said, there were 8 or 10 of these young women. They were probably all in their 20s. Our group of a half a dozen tuxedo-clad men. I was probably the youngest, and in those days, I was probably in my mid 40s at least, and most of the people were in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And we're having a drink, and these young women are looking at us sort of like, and we weren't overly rowdy or anything, but they're sort of looking at us, and at some point one of them comes over to our table and says, we've been looking, or we've noticed you, and you all look very nice in your tuxedos and everything. Were you here, are you here for a wedding or something? And one of our group, who probably was well in his cups, as many of us were, says, "Well, as a matter of fact, no, we're not here for a wedding. We're a group that meets once a year. We get together once a year, we all have something in common. And the young lady said, well, what is that? And he said, well, we're all gynecologists who have delivered the children of royalty. And the woman raised her eyebrows. Wow. And
Where'd that come from?
And the people and the other Diogenes Club members at the table are somewhat snickering. And then the next person sort of picks this up and he says, well, that's not really true. He said, actually, we all are owners of thoroughbred horses who have run in the Kentucky Derby. And the next person then says, oh, we are all owners of Lamborghinis. Anyway, so it's going around the table like this. I'm the last one. So it comes to me, and I said, well, these guys are having a bit of fun with you. In point of fact, we all belong to a local Sherlock Holmes society. We get together for dinner 6 times a year. And the woman looks at me and said, now that's really ridiculous. So, so anyway, that was, I always remember that experience.
Okay, now you're really pulling my leg.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Anyway,
that is great. Oh, that's funny.
So, and there've been, it's about the people. It's about fun like that. Yeah. It's about running into people all over the world who have this. I mean, one of the things that not that I set out to do this, but Connie and I travel a bit, and just happenstantially during our travels, and if we're traveling to a place that Conan Doyle has traveled to, and he was quite a world traveler, especially given that age prior to jet planes and things like that. I always check out to see if he was in this city, right. And maybe there's a place in the city that I should at least not necessarily visit, but walk past and take a picture of or something. Oh, yeah. And I've ended up probably either staying at or visiting hotels in as far flung places as Cape Town, South Africa, and Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe, and the little village of Oi, Norway, all of which have hotels that Conan Doyle has stayed in when he traveled there. That's cool. So things like, I mean, it's not the focus of my hobby, but if I happen to be there, I'll do it. And
it's an experience that you can.
Yeah, exactly. And I get into in Norway, in this little town of Oy, I think it's spelled Ouye. They actually have the room in which he stayed in for 2 nights when he was there, and they have a little plaque on it and everything else. Cool. And I asked the manager, I knew it was there, but I didn't know where it was. And this is this hotel probably had a dozen rooms, if that. And she said, oh, let me show you. And she starts asking me questions. Why am I interested? And it was just, this long, wonderful conversation. So it's about the people. It's about the friendships and ultimately the fun that we have.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. We're just about out of time, Michael. Time goes fast on these things. They're fun, and then next thing you know, we're about out of time. I just have one question. I know the pandemic was really challenging to take the reins of the BSI, but we've had a live dinner. So how are you feeling about it now? How are things looking for you from your chair?
I feel very, very good. I mean, Mike Whalen left the BSI in wonderful shape. He added many parts to our organization in his 23 years. That was the good news. The bad news is that he added many parts to the organization. And in Mike's case, he had a strong right arm in Marianne. So I found in taking over that I initially had to figure out how to do the work of 2 people. I've been tremendously fortunate in having a great many wonderful volunteers. People have just stepped up There's no way, and as you mentioned, we've just had our first in-person meeting without the help of people like Bob Katz, who serves, excuse me, as my Cartwright, and Randall Stock, with all of his technical and computer help, and Greg Ruby, in terms of handling the manual registration process, all of which Mary Ann used to handle in the past, and Greg has handled for us this year, and it's worked for the most part very, very smoothly. So I've been really, really fortunate to have all of that. I took over, and that was the good news. I mean, in terms of having a lot of help. The bad news was that exactly 7 weeks after I took over as Wiggins, COVID-19 emerged. And that was one that nobody saw coming. So that made life a little more challenging and interesting. But we've moved along, and I've had a lot of good advice in terms of things we can do and can't do. Some of it, by the way, and my hat's off if I were wearing a hat to you, Steve, when you and I had in-depth conversations at one time when we did our virtual meeting 2 meetings ago.
Mm-hmm.
And without your help, without your professional technical focus, we could have never pulled that off as beautifully as we did.
No.
And I know I've thanked you in the past, but let me thank you in front of your worldwide audience.
Well,
And so it's been a challenge, but it's I think anybody that serves in the Wiggins role and who works with the Wigginses to help them, it's a labor of love. And fortunately, there are many of us who dearly love the Baker Street Irregulars and our organization and everything that it stands for, and continue to volunteer. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, great. Michael, this has been fun. We could do a whole other show, and maybe we will.
It's been a pleasure, and I'm sorry for rambling on.
No, it's
so
been
much,
great.
But if anything else, you probably can ascertain that I remain enthusiastic.
That's good to know. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I look forward to seeing you in person again soon. We're in New York recently, and we will. So take care, and thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch. I want to thank everybody for your wonderful feedback. It's the kind of thing that keeps you going when you're doing something like this, and it really matters. So if you are a fan of the show, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like it when you see it on Facebook. Share it with your friends. That'd mean a lot to us. But really, just your kind comments and notes and that sort of thing really go a long way, very long way. Well, that's all we've got. We had a long show today, so we must say goodbye. But be sure to be back for the next episode, because it's going to be a special one. Take care, and we'll see you then.